Proportional Response, Book 1. Chapter 11, Part 4, A Lady's Honor. Hannibal walked into the human embassy with the Duke and his wives right behind him. After the excitement with the assassin, he'd tried to get them to wait until the next day, but they'd insisted. It feels so strange to be preceding the Duke into the room. But since he is here under the persona of the head of Alincourt, rather than as himself, I have the rank. Still, it just... Henry sat at the now infamous table in the human embassy foyer, staring at the holodisplay and typing, with his back to the door. As soon as the doors shut, the display turned green. Good, the privacy field is on. Hannibal stepped to the side as the Duke moved forward with a new sort of energy in his step, and Henry spun his chair about, then practically bounded out of it. His movement toward Kasler looked almost more like bouncing than walking. Both men had large grins on their faces, and the Duke's wives had long-suffering, but amused, looks on theirs. Before he could even get a word in edgewise, the men had met, and, instead of shaking hands, grasped each other's forearms and slapped each other on the shoulder. Realizing that he may not get another chance, and trying to make sure that at least the minimum protocols were observed, Hannibal cleared his throat and spoke. Your Royal Grace, I am pleased to introduce Henry Thomason Archer, the Ambassador of the Human Confederation of Worlds. Ambassador, may I introduce? Henry got a glint in his eye. He and the Duke remained locked in position, each holding the other's forearm as Henry spoke. His Stellar Grace, High Lord of Swords, Knight of the Diadem, and Royal Adjunct, Duke Kasler Archibald Feldarin. He looked at the two men, and both wore heavily amused grins. Those grips look painful, each is flexing. What are they doing? Both men laughed softly and clapped each other on the shoulder again, this time with force, and they separated. Henry moved over to the Lady Golnar, took her hand, bowed, blew slightly on it, and spoke. Lady Golnar, Relor Feldarin, the reports on your stunning presence do not do you justice. Lady Golnar quirked a half smile at him and nodded in reply. He repeated the motions with Yoro. Lady Yoro Sella Feldarin, you are lovely indeed, despite your efforts to hide it. I would be very interested to know how much information those glasses of yours can display. She seemed slightly taken aback for a brief moment, and the Duke chuckled as she gave Henry a wry smile and a nod of respect. He made a much more elaborate bow to Lady Ironor, actually kissed her hand, winked suggestively at her, and did something with his eyebrows that caused her to blush. Lady Ironor Kenso Feldarin, your pictures do no justice to the pinnacle of allure that I find standing before me. He wore a wolfish grin, but his eyes shone with pure mischief rather than desire. Ironor brought her hand to her mouth, cocked her hip, giggled suggestively, and answered, Oh my dear, you must be cautious. You will make my beloved husband, or my sister wives, oh so jealous. Henry straightened, and his grin widened as he dramatically threw his arms wide. How could I make the other women jealous? How could the beauty of the ocean's depth, or of the moon's treasured glow, be jealous of the beauty of the stars? As for your husband... Henry made the briefest glance at the Duke, who wore an expression of amusement, and coupled with a sly smile. Well, what of him? Come away with me, and I will whisk you off to... Hannibal's heart froze, again, in his chest for the second time in a day. What was Henry doing? Kasler took a threatening step forward, a picture of fury on his face, and amusement twinkling in his eye. The Duke made a grand, over-dramatic gesture with his hands and spoke in heavily melodramatic tones. What is this, foul human? You think you can just sweep my wife away from me? No, you scurvy human. I will not have it. Arm yourself, for I shall return on the nonce, and I shall trounce thee. Henry stood and blinked at the man for a fraction of a moment. A micro-expression of horror crossed his face so fast that most would have missed it, but Hannibal knew his friend. Then Henry got a strange look on his face, made a grand gesture with his hand, stepped in front of Lady Ironor in a protective fashion, and responded in similar melodramatic tones. Fear not, fair maiden, I shall rescue you from this fallow cur. Feldarin, if it is a challenge you want, it is a challenge you shall have. But I will not have you challenge me and then run like a dog. I had hoped that we could be friends of honor, But I see that honor is lost on you, so I give you the gift I had intended to provide. May you choke on it." Henry gestured to someone at the door. The young lady had been standing, eyes wide, in the doorway, apparently intending to find out the cause of all the commotion. She seemed to understand Henry's gesture, because she nodded and scurried away. The two men continued to bluster and carry on, devising more and more elaborate insults to throw at each other. Anibel's translator strained to catch up, then his eyes went wide. The Duke was speaking in English. They approached one another several times and seemed about to come to blows, but backed away to make further grand gestures and hurl insults, while the women giggled and placed bets between themselves. Have they all gone mad? He could tell the two men were gearing up to fight, but couldn't understand how it hadn't already come to blows. Visions of trying to explain to Her Majesty, through text no less, how he'd managed to allow the plan to end, and either the Duke, the human ambassador, or he should prevail, both to die with him standing there, made his head feel like it was about to explode. Both men seemed to have an amused look in their eyes, which stopped him for a while, but he couldn't let this come to violence. He finally stepped forward, hand out, ready to try to defuse the situation, and a delicate female hand landed on his shoulder. A light voice, like silver bells, whispered into his ear. "Everything is fine, darling. My husband has been fascinated by the human rituals of male bonding and wanted to try them out. I'd say, based on our research and how amused the human appears to be, that he is doing rather well, but you know the man better." Anibel gulped and nodded. "I've never seen Henry like this, but his anger is obviously feigned, and he appears to be having fun." Just then, the young woman returned with several others in tow. All of them carried ancient-styled weapons and armor. One man pushed a mannequin wearing armor made of leather and metal, well crafted, designed to cover much of the body. Henry stopped mid-insult and gestured to the armor. "Behold, you foul brigand, the work of my own hands. You will find the doll fits your size exactly, almost as well as its vacant expression fits your vapid intellect. I believe it will fit you well. Now you shall not need to run away and make excuses on the armor and face me like a man." The Duke looked the armor over with a judicious eye, and obviously liked what he saw. "A fine set of armor, to come from hands so poor as thine. Very well, I shall wear it, and laugh as I whip thee." Caslow threw off his robe, then pulled off shirt and pants to reveal a one-piece jumpsuit beneath. It took Henry barely a moment to reveal he had something similar on under his clothes. Did they plan this without contacting me? The two men had their armor on in minutes. Caslow's wives went to help him, but he shrugged them off. Einbal heard him say something about an extraordinarily self-reliant design. A set of sword-era weapons and shields had been placed against the walls, and at some point, the large table which he'd always believed to be a permanent fixture of the room had disappeared. Henry nodded and motioned to the weapons. Caslow picked up a fairly large shield and a sword. "No, wait, that wasn't made of metal. It was some sort of round cylinder with tape wrapped around it." He tried to examine the thing from his distance, but Henry had already picked up a matching sword and weapon. The two of them made an elaborate show of saluting one another, then verbally praising Lady Ironor and vowing to fight for her honor, or her hand, or something. They were using some odd dialect of English, and the translator had begun to have trouble keeping up. With that, the two men brought their weapons up and began to circle. A crowd of humans had assembled and formed a wide ring around them. Caslow's wives had each staked out a human. An armored human. How many of these mad people did this crazy thing? How did they get here and in armor so fast? He shook his head and checked again on the wives. Each stood next to an armored human and spoke with them in hushed tones while they watched the fight with obvious enthusiasm. A loud, crashing sound, followed by a rapid-fire string of more loud noises, brought his full attention back to the fighting men. Their swords moved so fast he could barely track it, but they always seemed to make contact either with the other sword or a shield. The men separated a little and continued to circle, then moved together to exchange blows before backing off. He could not tell what prompted either movement, but the other armored men and the duchesses certainly seemed to understand. They moved together again, and suddenly Henry's sword struck the Duke's helm hard enough that the metal rang like a bell. The Duke flounced to the ground and tossed away his sword, his feet briefly kicking up in the air. Cheers and applause came up from the crowd, but panic took Enable. Couldn't they see the man had been hurt? Henry made an elaborate salute to the Duke, now lying still upon the ground with his chest heaving. Enable made to rush to him, but then the cheering subsided and he could hear the last sound he expected coming from the ground. Laughter. The Duke sprang to his feet. "Well met. I do believe honor is satisfied, is it not?" Enable could see Henry's teeth gleam through the bars on his helmet. "Oh, I would certainly say so. I must compliment you on your sword work. You nearly had me more than once. You fought well, and certainly surprised me with that last move. By the way, show me that again. I'm still trying to figure out how you got past my guard." Enable moved back into position in the crowd as they faced off, and Henry's arm snapped out to, once again, ring the Duke's helm like a bell. The Duke stood up, cocked his head sideways slightly, got back into stance and said, "Oh!" Again. Henry repeated the attack, and this time the Duke almost managed to get his sword to a block, but failed. He stood straight, got back into stance, and said, "Okay, let me see it at half speed." Henry obliged, and hadn't finished the shot when the Duke exclaimed, "Aha! No wonder I couldn't block that. If I tried that, I'd break my elbow. I had no idea the shot could land there from that angle. Excellent. Now, do it again, at full speed." They faced off, and Henry's sword whistled through the air, only to be stopped this time by the Duke's shield. He could see Calzor's teeth through the helmet bars. Both men nodded and began to go at it full tilt again. It didn't take long before he heard the wet thwack of wooden tape on leather, and Henry hollered out, "Good.